private sports sector and look specifically at how stadiums, arenas, and convention centers are funded and where the money comes from and what that looks like. So up until this point in time, we have just kind of discerned what is public sport, what is private sport, and what are the financial models those two sectors use, and how they cross over and support one another, and how they're vastly similar and vastly different in many ways. We drew a number of examples on the board, and I subdivided them every time and talked to you about one's a service and one's for profit, talked to you about it, have different financial models, etc. And even showed you toward the end that there was some crossover sharing. I want to go with that into the sourcing of public sector funding. How do cities, how do local communities, how do counties come up with money to build a baseball stadium, to build a expensive football stadium, to build an arena for the public, for the sharing of public services? So when a team says, we need a new stadium, when an ownership group says we want our stadium upgraded, when a local community says we'd like to have a minor league baseball stadium, where does the money come from? We don't have printing presses. We don't have the ability to produce wealth or produce resources in an instant. There has to be a means of accruing those resources and setting aside monies, finding monies, generating resources so that we can do these particular projects. So this study this week is kind of looking at where are the monies derived from that build these large-scale stadiums, arenas, and convention centers that we're so often seeing our favorite football teams play, and etc. So I do want to give a little history to that, and so then talk about the current trends in the environment. And so the trend today is that the local governments, your local city officials, your county officials, your state governments, today assume a primary first-person fiscal and operating responsibility for major league facilities. And so in today's environment, the person in the driver's seat is always that municipality, that government agency who is actually going to, and not the right word is to own, but to manage a project and to provide it for the community. So all of your big cities that have stadiums, arenas, convention centers, all of your smaller cities that have facilities for minor league sport, those facility projects come under the leadership and the guidance and the management of the community organizers. Now, they may subcontract a private group, they may hire a private group, they may hire in-house a project manager and someone to oversee it, or several someones. But in the end, the people in the driver's seat who are responsible for the fiscal and the operational and the overall development of these kinds of facilities is first and foremost going to be your local government officials, or it could be your county officials, or it could be your state officials. There's a number of involved parties in a project like this. Now, this didn't used to be the case, and it is fascinating if you go back, say 100 years, when some of the original NFL teams were formed and some of the original Major League Baseball teams were formed, the playgrounds, the facilities, the original stadiums that they played in, those were largely owned privately by the team owners. And so if you go back into the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers or the New York Giants or some of the other teams that have a long, rich tradition and a very long tenure as an organization, you'll find that the original owners of those were the ones that developed the first fields and facilities that they played in. And literally through the first 30 or 40 years, 50 years of most of our sport properties, that is to be the case. Now that started to change once we had World War I and basically World War II. Coming out of World War II, we had some changes in the sport profession. You had men go off to war, and many men didn't come back. You had women go into the workforce and basically really, I don't want to say take over the workforce, but they made a significant impact in the workforce. And so the work climate kind of changed coming out of World War II in the 1950s. And as we started to kind of restart professional sport, it kind of lingered through the wars because you didn't have a lot of men and young boys to play college sport and professional sport because they were serving the war product or off at one of the war theaters during World War II and some of the other wars. What happened was a lot of these ownership groups, when professional sports started to kind of restart and rebrand and revamp in the 1950s, they didn't have the significant resources necessary to upgrade facilities, or many of them weren't playing in stadiums and they needed a stadium because now you had more fans. When the men came back from the war, and now women were working in the workforce and they had money and they wanted to be entertained, you had a larger people group with resources ready to be entertained in the 1950s and 1960s. And so what you began to see was the transition from the private funding of these facilities. It actually reverted back to the public funding. And so counties and communities and city organizers began to basically take over the responsibilities for the projects. These projects would be building some of the original stadiums that maybe your teams used to play in 30 and 40 years ago. And so it flipped, and the government agencies, the bureaucratic agencies, literally from the 1950s on, were the ones that kind of spearheaded these projects. They saw it as a way to provide for people in a community. Greenville County has several 100,000 people, and we can provide entertainment by building a convention center, by building a baseball stadium, and then hosting events and doing things at both facilities. So the community organizers, your mayors, your county officials, and your all of your bureaucratic individuals really kind of took over these sort of projects, and therefore they came under the funding of the public arena. And since the 1950s, it was largely the public that supported these, but back then the stadiums, arenas, convention centers were not expensive. It was very inexpensive to build a baseball stadium in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Remember, everything changed in the 1990s when we added all these amenities and we upgraded and brought in the internet, and we started to do luxury suites and luxury boxes and private seat licenses and personal seats, and we basically changed the spectatorship and viewership of professional sport in the 90s and even starting in the late 80s, but really in the 90s and 21st century. And then we began to build these massive coliseums. We went from small stadiums, arenas, and convention centers that did not have all of the amenities, that did not need all the bells and whistles. Remember, we used to have lots of cheap seats in these facilities, and we replaced them with sport for the rich. We put a lot of expensive luxury suites and luxury boxes and restaurants and water features. And remember, if you go around the country and around the world, you'll see stadiums with museums in them and workout centers and all kinds of things that can be made available to you for the right price. And so that drove the cost of building these and renovating these through the roof. It tremendously escalated the cost. And so by the time we hit the 1980s and 1990s, and the stadium development and the renovation and the rebranding of teams really began to hit the public hard. And the public was having a hard time being able to financially support and justify, remember the opportunity cost, being able to justify, is it a good use to put $500 million toward a new stadium when we need hospitals and we need soup kitchens and we need more police and we need more firemen, we need water, and we need better electrical grids, and we need, and I could go on and on and on about just the basic public needs, library system, the school systems need more money, and on and on and on. So you had this real ethical challenge and moral dilemma where we began to realize that the public was no longer financially capable of solely footing and subsidizing the bill for professional sport, and we had to begin to start sharing the responsibility. So the era that we actually live in today is a little bit more of a shared responsibility. And if you happen to read the articles or look at some of the stadiums, the arenas, and convention centers that are actually being built in the last 15 or 20 years, you'll find that we're actually downsizing them to a more manageable size of spectatorship. And the cost of those, although the cost is still tremendous, the cost of those is being shared with a public-private relationship, whereas in the last 40 years, the public had to fund everything. In the era that we live in now, the private teams and the private entrepreneurs are having to raise 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50% of the monies in order to build a new state-of-the-art facility. So if you look at, for example, when the Dallas Cowboys built their new facility, there is public monies, but there's also private monies that went into that joint venture relationship to make that happen. There were state monies, there were all kinds of monies. And I can give you lots of examples. The racetrack in Texas, Texas Motor Speedway, had a combination of private and public monies that went in to build that, and several other examples like that. And I think you'll find is, if for those of you that are interested, if you read about those, you'll see that the private involvement, private entrepreneurs are being challenged to raise a greater portion of that because the public is just unwilling to foot the bill, nor are we capable of footing the bill. So that's where I want to go. That's kind of the historical view and a little bit of the trend there. Let me see, I probably got ahead of myself. So public subsidy, and you can read some of this in your book. I'm going to give you a few pages in your book to look at as well to kind of tie all this together. And I just mentioned the current trend. I did get ahead of myself. Team owners and the teams have begun to pay a larger share of the initial costs, and so, you know, between the 1950s and the 1990s, the team owners weren't paying anything. There was no responsibility shared. And then as the cost of stadiums, arenas, convention centers kept going through the roof, the public was no longer able to afford that. And in the current era right now, local governments are sharing the responsibility. And so local governments do still contribute a considerable amount of resources, and those resources come in the forms of public tax resources. But it is a shared responsibility. And so that's the first kind of point I want to make, is today's era is a more of a partnership where you have public and private. You have the taxpayer base and the local governments and the communities. That's the public portion. And you have the teams and the private team owners and the leagues subsidizing together to actually build the brand new stadiums, brand new arenas, brand new convention centers. And that's the current trend. And the tendency, we offer franchises, very generous leases. We'll help you build a new stadium, and we'll lease it to you with a lot of generous provisions, but we're not going to fund the whole thing, is what local governments have been saying in the past, almost 25, 30 years. Probably not as long as that, because it's been an evolving organic process. But the truth is, the local agencies, the local governments have had to go back to team owners and leagues and say, we can't afford to do this. And so therefore, you're going to have to subsidize and partner with us. And so we can turn around and then offer them very, very good lease arrangements where the lease payments are low, or they get to keep more of the parking money and more of the concessions money and more of the merchandise sales. So instead of splitting that 50-50, maybe it's 60-40 or 70-30. So the team gets a larger share of revenues, which works in the favor of the team because the team is more motivated to sell merchandise or sell product. And the more they sell, the more they get to keep. So that would be an advantageous provision, particularly if you are a team that sells a lot of merchandise. And again, not every team is. If we analyzed all the minor leagues baseball teams and all the minor league hockey teams, you'd obviously find some organizations that are very good at selling merchandise. You'd find other organizations that are very good at selling tickets. And you'd find other organizations that are very good at selling food and beverage. And it's not going to be one size fits all, or all of them do it all well. Largely it's based on economics and market structure and people groups and a number of things. But what you'll find is, no matter which one of those are, those organizations will benefit from generous lease arrangements. They can build those things into their lease arrangements where we get to keep a majority of the food and beverage, or majority of the parking monies, or majority of the ticket sales. Whereas in the old days, that was either all given back to the city, or it was in some shared relationship there. The team has to make money in the old days, and they did. But now the city's saying, if you come in with more capital on the front end, we'll allow you to keep more of the operating profits on the back end. And so then guys like Jerry Jones, who own the Dallas Cowboys, and other organizers can go out and raise money and upgrade a stadium or build a new facility, because they're going to reap even more of the benefit the 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years after it's built. So they can invest significant capital into the project, then they can reap it back multiple times over if they sell merchandise and win games and do all that. Now, as a person who is a public person, someone who's not a team owner or doesn't work for a team myself, we the populace likes that, because what happens is the more money they extract from me means they have to tax me more. And that's kind of where this is gonna go a little bit, is that you're gonna quickly learn that in order for the public governments to raise the monies they need, they just have to tax the people, tax them more unique ways to be able to extract that money, so they have to be able to build these stadiums, arenas, convention centers. So people today are not customarily enjoying being taxed and taxed more and more and more at the local level, the state level, let alone the federal level. I think that there's two administrations. There's one that's in the office now, and they've lowered federal income taxes. You have an administration that's trying to fight to get in, and they're promising you they will raise taxes. And I think if we just surveyed the people in the public, they would prefer lower taxes. They would already tell you that they're overtaxed, and it's really very disheartening for them. And so we want to talk about, where does the public derive their money from when they built those facilities, primarily funding it themselves, or in this era where they subsidize greatly to still support that. And it comes from two major sources. All counties, all cities, all government entities have multiple revenue streams, but two of the most significant revenue streams for any government agency is hard taxes and soft taxes. So today I kind of want to differentiate between hard taxes and soft taxes, and you may have never heard this before, so I don't want to go too far down in the weeds, but I do want to explain them enough where you have some understanding, and then we'll get into some of the more specific soft taxes and even sports taxes, and then bonds in the next class. So two central types of taxes that bureaucrats will levy on local populous people in order to fund any operations in a county or a city or a community. The hard taxes, just as a general rule of thumb, the tax burden is always borne on all the taxpayers within that jurisdiction, all the people that live there and reside there and operate there. So all of us in here, we pay taxes in some way, shape, or form. You'll find that you are a person that does pay hard taxes. You may not be aware of how it's extracted out of your life and out of your billfold, but I'm going to explain some of that. And again, it's the hard taxes and the soft taxes that fund governments, which allows them to be able to do nice, fancy sports stadiums. So if you like nice, fancy sports stadiums, always pay your taxes, pay them on time, be willing to pay more than your fair share. Now, the biggest challenge with hard taxes is it largely always requires voter approval. So when a community organizer, when a politician, when a city official decides they need more money for a new baseball stadium, we got a nice basketball arena and we have a nice football stadium, but we don't have a baseball stadium, and we want to be able to build the community a nice baseball stadium, we need to raise the hard taxes on people. But luckily for us, in the state constitutions around the country, one of the provisions there is that it has to receive voter approval. Now, there are obvious ways around that. If you haven't read enough in the media today, they figure out a way to get around anything these days, it seems like. And neighbor across the street who moved down from Michigan. He's lived here in Greenville, South Carolina, 6 years, and lives right across the street from me. His name's Marty and the family, and they're wonderful conservative folks and voted conservative here in South Carolina. And he just happened to be talking to his sister in Michigan, and his sister got 6 mail-in ballots the 6 weeks before the Michigan vote. And so then my neighbor, Marty, decided to check the voter registration in Michigan, and his son, who's now 22, even though they've lived down here 6 years, his son has voted in the last 3 elections in Michigan, even though they've lived down here and been registered voters in South Carolina for 6 years. So somebody obviously stole his son's identity and has voted for him in the last 3 elections. It'd be presidential, midterm presidential if you go back. And so my neighbor is fighting that, trying to get that fixed. They can figure out a way to game anything, and it's really kind of unfortunate and disheartening when you start to think about it. But the state constitutions, when they were written, South Carolina is one of the original colonies, one of the original early states into the Union, and I think the Constitution was written in like 1865 or something like that. But if you were to read that state constitution, you would find some of the provisions for the local tax base, and some of these original provisions are built into those constitutional documents that all the states adopted as they came into the Union. And one of those things is that the people would control the flow of money to public agencies, and so therefore hard taxes always require voter approval. We have to have a unanimous approval, majority approval, whatever that percentage number is they have built in there, in order to instill new hard taxes or raise new hard taxes. Now what that really means is on the local level, and this has always been the case, on the local level our vote counts for the raising of our taxes. And I'll get to what are the hard taxes, just so you know. But let's realize first and foremost that governments, if they want to build a new baseball stadium or a new hospital or a new soup kitchen or a new fire department, they just can't tax you more by raising hard taxes. They actually have to come and ask our permission. Now we like that. Nobody wants to have other people just take money out of their account and use it for whatever means. We'd like to have a democratic process where we either approve or disapprove and have debate and discourse over things. And so again, we love constitutionalists, love this, revisionists don't like this, but constitutionalists love the fact that the people approve going into something or approve coming out of something. You can't raise hard taxes on the Greenville County of people unless Greenville County approves it. Now let me separate that from soft taxes so we know what soft taxes are. Soft taxes, hence the word soft, are a little more pliable, a little more malleable, a little more easily to manage. I won't use the word manipulate, but let's just say they're easy to manage. The tax burden is borne not on the entire populace, but a soft tax can be directed toward one people group. And therefore it's apportioned is the right legal term, by a relatively small portion of taxpayers. We can create a soft tax and put it on restaurants, or taxis, or hotels. So common soft taxes, in this instance, are taxes that are created by governments to fund their projects, and they're levied on a small group of people. So in most communities, you're going to find a restaurant tax. You'll find a taxi tax. You'll find a hotel motel tax. You'll even find what's called a sin-based tax when people buy the sin-based products. There's an additional tax, not just the regular sales tax. There's actually an additional percentage or two or partial percentages levied onto those to extract more money for government projects. So what happens is local governments, when their budget doesn't meet the needs that they have, and they wanna build additional things, they have to raise additional dollars. They'll either create a brand new soft tax and levy it onto a smaller portion of the tax base. Or they'll increase the percentage or the rate of a current soft tax to extract more money from that base. And so that's why you see this picture here of the heavier tax borne not by an entire group of people, but by a small group of people. And this does not require universal voter approval in the communities. There's a different process the governments go through to levy soft taxes on you and I to fund their projects. So again, you gotta keep an eye on your government agencies. That's why you want to elect very financially stewardly individuals, not reflective of any party or any alignment, but certainly whoever they are, you want to elect financially stewardly and honest individuals because they do have a power of a pen to increase taxes and levy additional taxes and play with soft taxes that affect local businesses and local taxpayers, much like ourselves. And I'll talk a little bit more on Thursday, but subsequent to both of those, there is the notion that community officials can also, in larger communities, where there is substantial value in the community and substantial resources, they actually can float bonds, single A, double A, triple A, quadruple A, 4A bonds, which are floated against the financials of a local community. The bonds will be sold, the money is raised, a stadium is built, and then the bonds are paid back. And so you can basically call it in advance. When an organization like a city or a county will float bonds, what's called a bond referendum, in order to build a stadium or arena or convention center, they're basically telling you they're going to leverage their assets in such a way as they can go to an agency and create the bonds that are approved, sold on what's called a bond market, and then they can use the money right now to build the new baseball stadium or the new marina or the new boating complex, whatever the community is trying to do. And then out of the revenues of the community or out of the revenues of the new project, they would be repaying those bonds over 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. So it's really more of an advance. It's almost a credit-based system where the bonds have to be approved based on the creditworthiness of the community, and it really only works in larger communities, larger cities, larger states that have strong credit ratings, a lot of resources, a lot of money flowing through it for a bond agency to even look at them or consider those kind of projects. Let me drill down just a little bit into hard taxes. I don't want to go too deep because this is not a tax accounting class, but I think it is good for us to know some of the characteristics of hard taxes and some of the characteristics of soft taxes. And I'm certainly going to skip over anything that I think is not noteworthy, but the things I do identify, they are noteworthy. And so, for example, the implementation of hard taxes, hence the word hard, is they're very difficult. They're harder because they require voter approval. So when the property tax, when the sales tax were implemented a long time ago, they sought voter approval. Those rates and percentages were set and those were carried forward, and they've been adjusted a few times, and only a few times, because they require our involvement. So the more general the tax purposes for a sport project, the larger the opposition. If a county or a city comes to us and say, well, we're going to build a series of new parks and golf courses, and we want to raise another $30 million, so we're going to increase your property taxes by 5% and your sales taxes by 2%. Well, that will be largely voted down. No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to give you more money to do that just because you want to and you have a desire to. So the general the more general the project, the likelier the opposition. And for the longest time, people largely have stood up to, particularly local governments, not so much the federal governments. There's a kind of a fear-based nature when you try to stand up. Of course, and you can see it going on today. There are organizations of people trying to stand up against the bullying of the federal government in certain instances or certain agencies. And it's a little more challenging. But at the local level, your voice is actually fairly strong because the populace that lives there are usually uniformly supportive of not raising taxes and being able to stand for truth and transparency when it comes to the use of local monies. The general property tax is probably the most common hard tax. And again, this tax is, like all, one of the main supporters or funders of your local governments, your local government agencies where they have revenues that come in, and this is one of the larger ones. And the general property tax is paid by all property owners or landowners with a few exceptions in a given jurisdiction. So here in the state of South Carolina, it's based on your county. So whatever county that you're in, we're in Greenville County, you pay property tax once a year to Greenville County. Now, for the longest time, and still to this day, property tax is the backbone of government finances. So where does Greenville County get the money to do the roads and to do the snow plowing when the ice comes and to cut the trees down and to do many of the county-related things, to manage and maintain the Department of Natural Resources in the local area and some of the local parks and some of those, the rec department and some of those kind of things. Well, that comes out of hard taxes. That comes out of property taxes. So as property taxes are collected, it goes to the county fund, it goes to the city fund, and that funds the city operations and the county operations. The overwhelming majority of property taxes, which are collected at the local level, actually stay here and remain at the local level. Now again, that's very appealing to those of us who are landowners and property owners. We don't like to see our taxes collected locally and then flown off to some place you never know, never ever land. So here in South Carolina, more than 96% of all the property tax revenues stay with your local governments. That would be the counties and the cities and the local jurisdictions. That's a good thing. So between 3 and 4% actually advance on up to the state, and the overwhelming majority stay here, and therefore you and I have a greater voice. Our monies stay here. We like that. And so if you were to make a comparison, the property tax is to the local government what the federal income tax is to the federal government. So where does the federal government get their money? Well, there's a lot of ways they do, but one of the most significant is the corporate federal returns and the individual federal returns. So you have a deadline by April 15th. April 15th is the individual return deadline. March 15th is the corporate return deadline to get your taxes filed and either paid or your refund sent off for next year. And so that goes to the federal government. The federal government is the ones that have collected your federal tax monies, or they're either going to send you a refund check or recollect what you owe if there's a debt or a deficit. So that funds the federal government. It is the property taxes that fund the local and community governments. So they're somewhat reciprocal in nature. If you own property in a jurisdiction, you have no choice but to pay property taxes. There's no opting out of it. There are a few concessions and carve-outs made. Churches, for example, once they establish their church 501c3 and they establish their nonprofit status in a local community, they are given special dispensation. Let me see if I should have. I did. It's on one of the slides. You have no choice they send you a tax bill, and you're required to pay it. And the governments don't play around when it comes to property taxes, because that's their primary revenue source. So what most lenders do with a mortgage is they escrow what's known as your taxes and insurance. And when you pay your property off, you have the right or ability to pay your local taxes separately. I do that with all the properties I own, because I have them send me a tax bill. I don't want to escrow and have somebody else keep my money for my own taxes and insurances. So that's something, once you become a savvy investor, as you mature in life, you would want to have your stop escrows, and you would want to pay your bills outright. But for the most part, most people that own properties in most situations are required, if they're escrowing it through their mortgage lender then takes that escrow money and sends it off and pays the tax bill, and then if there's an overage or an underage, you'd actually get a second bill, or you get a small check from them. But the banks collect it and keep it for you and pay it unless you choose or you opt out of it. But in either case, anybody that owns real estate individually in a local jurisdiction are always gonna be required to pay property taxes every year. And if you don't pay property taxes, the county will put a lien on your property, and eventually they'll foreclose on you. Even if you own your property outright, they have the ability to do that. Now, property taxes in South Carolina are very, very reasonable. I've owned property in Florida and Ohio. I'll tell you, the property taxes in Florida are extremely high, and that's because property values are extremely high, because Florida is a tourist state, and many, many wealthy people like to move to Florida. Also, there's no state income tax, and so because there's no state income tax in Florida, and that's why a lot of athletes like to move there, is because their income is not taxed. There is significant property taxes that are levied on people, so that's how they make up for the difference there. The second thing is that your local governments can always rely on property taxes. So there's a dependable tax base that'll always fund local governments. It's not like these properties come and go. All this land in Greenville County is always gonna be here and stay here. Somebody's going to own it. Now, there might be a few properties for sale around the state, and I say few, there's a lot. But the truth is, somebody still owns every one of those pieces of lands, and for most of those, the ones that don't have concessions, they're gonna get a property bill. So in that regard, your local governments can rely on receiving that money. And it sometimes can also be classified as a benefit tax. Because in regards to special projects, as governments collect these resources, they can always look at the kitty and determine whether or not they want to build additional stadiums, arenas, convention centers, hospitals, or whatever it is, libraries. They can always, as a benefit, these revenues are used to finance the local expenditures that in the end benefit the property owners. So I want them using the tax monies that I give them to build things that my kids and I might be able to use, so that we would benefit from it. If they build a baseball stadium locally, I can benefit by going to it. My children and I can be a part of it, and we can actually say, well, I helped fund that. Now, I don't own a portion of it. It's not how it works, but in some regards, both directly and indirectly, I helped fund the building of the Drive Stadium downtown, for example. And so it's a benefit tax. It benefits us. If they build libraries, my kids can go use the libraries. In fact, we do. My children all have library cards, and we go regularly and check out books from the libraries. So supporting the local library system through taxes actually benefits me in the long run. And here's some of the many, many things that the local governments use those hard tax dollars for. Road projects and sewage projects and library projects, and all your public education is funded through your tax dollars here. All your first responders, all your mayor and council members, and your board of educators. So the notion of a benefit is that all of these, we partake in one way, shape, or form or another. They have to be funded and supported, so the hard tax is the key support for that. I benefit from that, so I can't really balk at the fact that I have to pay property taxes every year. I don't always like it when they go up, and they do have small inflationary increases that are built into them based on certain millage rates and property values. As my value of my property goes up, my tax will go up. So it is in the county's best interest to always increase the value of properties because it increases the amount of tax they're generating. So it is an interesting kind of paradigm where they will go around and assess properties, and they don't too often assess them down, they'll assess them up, and then the county gets to generate a few more tax dollars on the increased value of your property, because it's always based on the value of your property. So all property owners are required to pay it. They send you lots of notices, they collect it. If you don't, bad things happen. It's really that easy. Now, there are a few organizations that are given special dispensations or exclusions. There are sport organizations that are given exclusions. They are given higher educational institutions. So North Greenville University, both public and private higher educational institutions, which have their 501c3 nonprofit statuses and are filed as nonprofits in your state, we're a not-for-profit organization. Therefore, the churches that your parents are members of or that you attend, the YMCA that you might be a member of or you go to, and this property you're sitting on right now are all excluded from paying tax in almost every state. Now, not every state. The exclusions vary from state to state, and they're granted and they're waived, and some of them are contracted, restricted. But these exclusions, when you start to pare these out, historical facilities and parks and rec and just a variety of places that have exclusions, when you actually take them out, then your tax base on property actually shrinks down. I don't know what the percentage is, 10 or 15 or 20%, but then what you have is you have a little bit smaller, not much, but a little bit smaller tax base that are paying for the majority of the operations once you carve all those out. So what is a tax base? Well, and don't worry about the aggregate value, it's just the overall properties in a given county, and everyone that owns them, is the starting point for the tax base. Now, if you rent an apartment, you're not part of that tax base because you're renting an apartment or renting a house or renting a trailer or modular. But if you own the dirt that it sits on, you're a part of the tax base. And so the municipalities need your revenues. They love to, they have this wonderful formula you might have heard about. It's called millages, where they take your property value and they multiply or divide it by the number of hundreds of dollars, and they have this crazy formula. Now, you don't have to know this, but I want to show this to you, is that they have a certain amount of assessments that they make and revenue that's required, and they subdivide one by the other, and they come up with this basic rate, and the tax rate of $1.40, for example, per $100 assessed value is a starting point, and then they go around and assess all the properties. And they say, okay, well, my property is valued at $330,000. Divide that by, the 100s and multiply that by $1.40, and that's what I owe. And $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a year is kind of where I pay property tax on the primary residence that I own. And each community has a slightly different variation to this, but they all basically do it the same. And so there's no straight table, it's a long metric that is put together. It'd be fun when you buy your first property to investigate that, what the millage rate is and what the property tax rate is, and see how they calculate that. If a municipality increases its budget expenditures, the assessed values remain the same, well then your property taxes automatically go up. And so if communities take on stadiums, arenas, convention projects, if they take on more libraries, if they add more fire stations and more 911 stations, and well, they're increasing their budget, they have to get the money somewhere, so they begin to assess you, the taxpayer, and they'll figure out ways to do it. Can't really raise the property tax, but what they can do is raise millage rates, and they can instill more soft taxes, and they can improve your property value, and that's how they extract more money from you. If their budgets go down, which wouldn't that be nice if we had good stewardly budget managers managing budgets and managing them downward on a regular basis, you'd actually see savings. And from time to time, I've seen that. I've had property tax. I've seen property tax go down in my life. I have seen the income tax go down when this current administration got in 2016. They did a nice tax bill, and they relieved. I received, I don't know, all of us received 3, 4, 5% tax relief, if not more, in the last 3 years. Now that's going to change if the next group gets in, because they want to significantly raise taxes on you, because they want to extract more of your money from you. So again, if you're a financially minded voter, then you would not vote for the parties that want to raise your taxes and crush you. And we think financially. That's why we're in this class. We have to be very stewardship with our spending, our buying, and our voting. The general property tax. Let me see. I don't need to do all this. This was more formulas of how they got to where they were. I'm less concerned. In fact, I'm going to take a couple of these slides out when I put them up online. Millage rates. It's a little excessive. Second hard tax, though, that I want to talk briefly about. I won't go too deep in the weeds. So the first one's property tax. The second one is the sales tax. And this has also been predominantly been around a long time. These are not new taxes. They're very customary and ordinary for people that operate in the marketplace. But the sales tax is the largest single source that funds your state governments, your state officials, your state individuals. So the hard tax of property tax supports your local officials. The hard tax of the sales tax largely supports your state government officials. So all those individuals that work for the state of South Carolina, and whether they work for the Department of Natural Resources for the state, or the Department of Revenue down in Columbia, all those government agencies that come out of Columbia that run things for the state government, they're funded and supported largely by sales tax. And they get, remember I said 3-4% of the property taxes sent to the state. So majority of their revenues come at the hands of state taxes. What is our state tax rate? It's 6 or 7%, and about 90% of that goes to Columbia. That comes out of that. There's a little bit that stays local, so that's a composition of most of it goes to Columbia, and a touch of it stays here. I think I got that built in here. Sometimes those change also. So local sales tax always rides piggyback with the larger state taxes, and so the state will set the tax rate. And then sometimes locally they'll add on another 0.5% or 2%. And we call that a regressive tax because it bears more heavily on lower income groups than it does on higher income groups. So it has a regressive nature to it, which is unfortunate. We can talk more about that later. I didn't want to get bogged down too much on that. So a sales tax is what you might call a user tax. You don't pay it unless you buy something. So you're interacting with the local marketplace. Not everything has sales tax on it, but for those products that do, it's only assessed of you when you actually use it or buy it. We're all taxed equally. The sales tax doesn't vary based on the value of our net assets or net worth, or what kind of instrument we're purchasing with. If it's debit card, credit card, cash, a check, VIN pay, so what you'll find is the combination of local and state sales tax rates may range from 3 to 10%. Some of the Midwestern states, I've seen them as low as 3 and 4%. And some of your higher assessed communities will have sales tax rates that'll be near that 9, 10%. And again, some communities and some states are so largely dependent on the sales tax revenues to fund state governments that they'll often have higher taxes. So if you're ever gonna move to another community, you can always look up what is the local tax rate and how much goes to the state, what is the state sales tax rate itself. So as an example of a state that has a 10% tax rate, 7% would go to the state, 2 would go to the county, 1 would go to the city. And so those monies would be subdivided as you pay for things. Let's see how we go on time. And one more slide and then we'll stop. So what products are taxed with sales tax? Not everything is, but obviously your tangible products, your stuff that's used in the home, in the community. No services. So when you buy a membership at the YMCA, when you buy a ticket to go to a Clemson football game, when you buy like if you go to see a sports psychologist, that'd be a service. Or if you go to a therapist, or if you go to a medical service provider, physical therapy for your knee, there's not sales tax that's being added on to that because of those services. Most perishables, not all of them, but most perishables are also exempt. So there's tremendous sales taxes on an automobile, it's a tangible product, but not on certain services. There's tremendous sales tax on certain products in the grocery stores. When you go to Lowe's, Home Depot, most all of those are considered perishable. But when you go to Food Line and you buy consumables, and the government doesn't tax you for those. So let me stop right here. We'll get this video up online, be studying this. And what we do on Thursday